For Daily Ask Reddit. Teachers of Reddit, how are you feeling about doing in-person classes right now? I'm an elementary teacher and this feels like one of those situations where there's just not a great answer. If we teach from home, I worry about how effective that teaching will be, how parents will manage that arrangement alongside their jobs. But if we do go back to school, all roads seem to lead to some form of madness. What happens if I contract COVID? Do I need to have 2 weeks of lessons prepared for a substitute at all times? Can there possibly be enough substitute teaching candidates out there to fill all the gaps left by COVID diagnosis, or suspected COVID diagnosis, or contact with COVID? Substitutes already do not make a living wage for their work, or if they do, it's barely so. I can't imagine they are going to be more enthusiastic about going to schools under these circumstances. What happens if my significant other, also a teacher, at a different school, comes into direct contact with a student at her school who has COVID? Do I have to quarantine because I've had direct contact with someone who has had direct contact with someone who has COVID? Our state released standards that basically said that if a student or employee shows a sign of COVID, they've got to go until they can prove they're clear. Signs include coughing. We obviously wouldn't send someone home for a random throat clearing cough. But what about when other sicknesses start popping up as winter nears? Will colds be presumed covered until proven otherwise? In the UK, English secondary schools are due back in full in September with no expectations of social distancing and very little guidance for risk assessment. I work in the worst affected borough of London, where huge numbers of our kids have lost family members. Over 50% of kids live in poverty. We have the highest levels of gang crime, radicalization, sex trafficking, child abuse, and neglect, and only around 5-10% of kids in classes have had access to internet for remote learning since we went into lockdown in March. Many I haven't heard from at all. Social services and child protective services are already overwhelmed. I'm worried for myself and my colleagues as we enter precarious working conditions. But mostly I worry for the kids and their community. We cannot go back to normal and many will be deeply traumatized. When I try to talk about how anxious I feel, nobody in my family or friendship group understands. They just tell me to stop worrying and enjoy my summer break. My wife is a principal and she's been at her school every day, including during the lockdown/quarantines, trying to figure this out. I fear for her health and safety, especially her mental and emotional well-being. I see the enormous amounts of stress being put upon her, and it kills me that I can't help. There are some truly cruel parents/people out there who feel they can treat my wife and her staff like trash because, well, I don't know why. I'd imagine most are just as frustrated as she is, and they are just taking it out on the school. But some are just self-centered, entitled assholes. Why make an already difficult situation harder? Despite what some might believe, teachers and staff haven't been lounging around at home, mailing it in and collecting pay. If anything, they're working harder and longer than ever. Given almost no notice, teachers and administrators had to completely redesign what school looks like almost overnight, and they succeeded. Kids were learning, children were being fed, needs were being met in the midst of a global crisis. No state agency did that, no so-called national experts on curriculum. The local educators fixed it in hours. Our government, with its infinite power, wealth, and resources, has done nothing but pretend the problem doesn't exist. In fact, state and federal policies actually made things more difficult, but local schools figured out how to get around that too. No complaining, no protesting, just solutions and amazingly clever plans. Remember that the next time someone tries to convince you that teachers don't deserve better pay and benefits. Remember that the next time someone tells you that teachers have it easy, or try to persuade you that educators are not among the smartest, most ingenious people in our society. I have very mixed feelings. I really miss my students and can't wait to see them. I know that online learning isn't the same, but I also fear for their health and the health of their families. I'm a speech pathologist, so while not a teacher, I do consider myself an educator. I provided services via telehealth from March through June, and continue to do so for those students who require summer services. 2 of my kids have highly intensive needs. so I see them at their home once a week now, which is terrifying, but it's what they need to make progress. The way I see it is, in March, I'm in New York, so I'm going on that timeline. We had to learn a completely different way of doing things. It was hard for the educators and the students, especially the students. So to me, going back to in-person learning is not the best choice, as it will look very different from in-person learning in the past. It's a lot of change for anyone, let alone young children. And if the numbers go up, we close all over again. I truly do not believe it is worth it. I understand the fact that many people rely on schools as childcare, but I also think that it is up to the government to handle that. High hopes. I know. I have many ideas on this whole thing that I could go on and on about, but that's just my 2 cents. College professor here. I really miss the wonderful classroom dynamics that in-person learning makes possible. Online learning makes discussions more strained and shallow. I also really love working with my students and discussing their projects one-on-one. That is much harder to do remotely. However, I care about my students as people, and the thought of making them and their families sick by returning to campus too soon makes me very worried. I want them to get a good education, but not at the expense of their health and well-being. I would rather work twice as hard to make online learning successful than risk them getting sick or losing parents and grandparents to this illness.